Hello, welcome back to Marathon Man, where I'm going through Doctor Who from the very beginning, and you join me at the first two-parter since The Rescue. I think this story might be the first example of how creatively Philip Hinchcliffe came to think as a producer, unless it was sort of like suggested to him by Letts. I'm not entirely sure how the decision came to be made or who made it, but the idea to separate the location filming and the studio filming for what could have been a six-parter into two separate stories, one 4 parts and one 2 parts. That's really good thinking behind the scenes. And it means we had that feeling of old from when a story would bleed into the next one, like the footprint atop the Himalaya, or the radiation reading too high, or the crew collapsing, and so on. And the ending of the Ark in Space finished with the Doctor, Sarah and Harry beaming down from the Nerva beacon, leaving the TARDIS behind to go and fix a broken transmat on Earth. And even though they were off, so to speak, we knew we'd be following on directly without the TARDIS because, well, we'd have to. And it felt nicely old school, like a nostalgic cherry on the top of a Troughton flavoured sundae. And those 60s vibes don't go anywhere at the beginning of the Sontaran experiment either. The location filming sort of brings with it as some soldiers are sort of like skulking about being stalked by a robot. That brings with it the feelings of a 1960s adventure as well. And as with the Ark in Space before it, the Sontaran experiment does feel very different from the Pertwee years, but again, it doesn't feel like it's forging completely new ground. There's something quite coy about it, actually, which I find quite charming. It's as if someone's trying to coax Doctor Who out of its comfort zone, but it's a little bit too shy to take its top off. The location work is decent too. Now, it's a nicely jarring moment when the Doctor tells his companions that they are in the centre of what was London, and that little detail goes a long way in rooting this story in its time and place. This is Earth of the far future, we've already been told that, but the nugget of information that they're standing in the middle of London, combined with the way the Doctor sort of throws it away nonchalantly, offers a heck of a lot of perspective. We haven't just heard the words that we're on a future Earth, we've felt it now. And that's a nice bit of writing, necessarily brief given the truncated length of this story, but impactful nonetheless. It's been quite a long time since we've had a 2-part serial, and there have been times where I've wondered whether that would have worked best as the default length of a Doctor Who story. Now obviously they're not getting the most out of their budget if they have to keep building sets every 2 episodes, so I know why they didn't do that. But I guess there are certain stories of Doctor Who that do feel, you know, stretched beyond their lifespan to cover the 4 episodes or the 6 or whatever. And weirdly, the Sontaran experiment, I'm not going to say it feels too short, but it has this sort of like, as I guess like The Rescue did and The Edge of Destruction did, it kind of has, rather than being a full adventure, because of its length, it feels more like a sidestep. And because it feels like a sidestep rather than a full adventure, I don't know, I guess the criteria for judging it feels slightly different. So, in those 2 episodes, is it full of story to be able to stand head and shoulders along with, you know, I guess like, I'm not going to use the Daleks' master plan, but longer, more epic stories? And the answer is no. But it fills its 2 episodes in a way that's better than some stories fill their 4 or fill their 6. So, by design, the Sontaran experiment ends up feeling more incidental than it does essential. And so, I guess expectations are managed slightly. So, if the Sontaran experiment were 4 episodes, then maybe I could agree with those that think the Sontaran experiment is very good. But because it has this sort of like, I guess, the Doctor gets distracted while he's doing a bit of maintenance, because it has that vibe to it, I actually really like it. Having met the Sontarans last season and been shown what a great idea for a race of Doctor Who monsters they are, this could have been that jump forward into something new that the show seems reluctant to make. Okay, so it could have ended up like Doctor Who does Saw, but that has merit as an idea, I think, because we know Doctor Who would never go so far as Saw does in the graphic stakes. And the way that the Sontaran experiment does portray Steyer's experiments is about as nasty as you can get for Doctor Who in its time slot in the mid-70s. And it's actually quite nice to see the Sontarans again, and it brings with it reminders of the last time on the marathon that I enjoyed a Doctor Who story without reservations. And so it's not really, maybe it's that I don't want the story to be longer, maybe it's that I just want it to be as good as the Time Warrior, which, you know, it isn't, but because of its almost disposable nature as a 2-episode sidestep, it doesn't need to be. And so, because it doesn't need to be, the fact that it isn't as big a disappointment as it normally would be. And Kevin Lindsay returning to play 2 new Sontarans here is a really nice touch, and it reinforces this idea that they're a clone race, especially as Steyr and the Marshal don't look anything like Lynx from the Time Warrior, despite what Sarah says. And Lindsay's really good again, making Steyr feel, as well as look, different from Lynx. That could be as a result, because they're a clone race, so it could be nurture rather than nature, the fact that, you know, Steyer's in different surroundings and up to something different, but it's probably more likely down to a very different tone. There is nothing whatsoever comic about what Steyr is doing with the humans as part of his experiments. The Time Warrior had a tone which suggested the Sontarans as a somewhat comic creation. Not that Lynx was played for laughs, because Lindsay played him quite straight, but a lot of what he said was written for laughs. Here, though, the Sontaran is taken deadly seriously, deliberately depriving a man of fluids for a shudderingly long time just to see what will happen. It's grotesque, and it goes a long way in suggesting what scope the Sontarans have as members of the Doctor Who universe. They can be approached in many different ways without having to be depicted or played massively differently. Now, when I did the video on the Time Warrior, I said that the Sontarans were created as a comic idea, and I still stand by that. I think that they are. But what the Sontaran experiment shows is that you can go in various different routes with them. So it doesn't really detract from my point in that earlier video, which is I think it's absolutely valid for Strax to be a funny Sontaran, because the Sontarans were created initially as a comic race. Yet you can argue that Lynx is depicted comedically but differently from the way Strax is humorously outlined. But the idea of humour in the Sontarans' makeup is absolutely a part of their creation. So I do think that Strax is a valid version of a Sontaran. What the Sontaran experiment does is it shows us that that's not the only string to their bow. It can be that, but they can do anything. And because the Sontarans can go various different routes, then it kind of only makes Strax feel more valid as a depiction, in my opinion. Their ongoing unseen war being their motivating factor makes them unique in the Doctor Who fold, and it gives potential writers and producers of the show so many justifications for including the Sontarans in any story. Their next 2 appearances don't really justify them all that well for me, but these first 2 encounters with Sontarans feel like very good use for them. And with this story being only 2 episodes, like, nothing drags. It's packed with incident at the beginning, which can't be said of every single Doctor Who story, and it pulls it all off really nicely. Harry's fall is done well, and in such a way that you worry about him. He had a chance to prove his moral decency in the last story, but here he gets to prove his courage and his resourcefulness. Aside from falling down the hole, he isn't once caught or captured, and is proactive in attempting to free Sarah. I am incredibly fond of Harry. He doesn't seem to be that well remembered when companions of Doctor Who get spoken about, but he's been great so far. I love it so much when he says,
"Well, don't you worry, old thing. I'll find a way. I'll get you out of there if I have to knock his belly head off and grab his keys."
He's old-fashioned, sure, but Marta takes that, calibrates it, and turns it into a really endearing streak of Harry's character. So, to the point where, when he calls Sarah old girl or old thing, it doesn't come across as patronising, it does come across as affectionate. It's a very considered performance and an incredibly successful one. I am so glad that Harry is along for the ride. And Tom stretches his legs further in this one as well, and I guess, like, we get to see more of his Doctor, obviously the more he goes on, but we get to see, like, really good and incisive glimpses into how he plays the part when his Doctor meets new people. When commanded to
"Now talk,"
his achingly benevolent reply,
"Certainly. What would you like me to talk about?"
doesn't come with noble sarcasm that his predecessors might have imbued it with. It comes with a kind of, like, offbeat sincerity. Likewise, when he realises that they think Nerva is a legend, he infuses his response with an enthusiastic curiosity, which feels like an acting choice only Tom Baker of the four would have made. And this sort of glimmer is what shows how good a grasp he will come to have on the character. Yet the relative rarity of these glimmers currently is what shows his slight reticence in really going for it, as if he's holding himself back as he assumes the colossal mantle of being the new Doctor Who. Not that he isn't committing to the job, because he absolutely is. I mean, he broke his collarbone and still had to do close-ups for a sword fight. And that you can't really tell if you didn't know kind of shows his level of professionalism, which is something to remember when a lot of stories about how difficult he became get bandied about. Anyway, this feeling of the way that Tom and his producer and his script editor have, it has the sense of building up to the moment where they realise, all of them collectively, what they are capable of. And as, I guess, we move towards that, it's beginning to feel electric. It may not have resulted in a truly brilliant story yet, but it's obvious that they're all taking the job incredibly seriously, at the same time as being sort of like, I guess, respectfully daunted a little bit by it. And even though it hasn't resulted in a truly brilliant story yet, it still makes for really interesting, immersive and fascinating watching. And really enjoyable watching too. After 391 episodes, it's nice to have this sort of like feeling of excited uncertainty. The show can still surprise, it seems.
Well, don't you worry, old thing. I'll find a way. I'll get you out of there if I have to knock his belly head off and grab his keys.
The new Sontaran mask, while not as terrible as, well, certainly the next ones, but it's just nowhere near as good as the original Lynx one. As ever, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this Sontaran sequel, then you know how YouTube works. Please do hit the like thumb and spread the word. It'd be great to get as many Doctor Who fans along for the marathon as possible. And what do you think of this one? Have I been unbelievably kind to it? Or is it a solid 2 episodes of Doctor Who? Is this a worthy reappearance for the Sontarans, or is it their worst story ever? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here soon for a story which consistently used to top the all-time best ever Doctor Who stories list. So if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button, clang the cloister bell, and I'll meet you on Skaro.